Welcome everyone to ET India Inc. Boardroom series, and on this special edition on the theme of assembling versus make in India. With me today on the fireside chat is none other than Mr. R.C. Bhargava, Chairman of Maruti Suzuki India. Today we will focus on getting his views on assembling versus make in India, and of course his take on the union budget, what it means for the overall manufacturing industry, and in particular auto sector. If time permits, we'll also try and wind up with his take on the electric vehicles. But first, let me set a quick context for our chat. The Indian economy has displayed strong recovery from the pandemic's deep abyss, and interestingly faster than most predictions. After an estimated 7.7% contraction in 2021, India's real GDP is projected to record a growth of 11% in 21-22. As highlighted in the economic survey, the country is on a V-shaped recovery, as is being seen with several high-level indicators already. There is a conscious effort by the government to drive a supply-side reform push and ease of regulation, thereby offering greater certainty and clarity to domestic and foreign investors. A core focus on higher infrastructure investments, stronger manufacturing through production-linked incentive scheme, and credit availability seem to have revitalized the government's $5 trillion vision. In my view, this budget is an important milestone in some ways like the one that marked India's liberalization in 1991. Overall, it's a forward-looking, growth-centric, capacity building, and debt-funded budget aimed at securing long-term economic growth and global competitiveness. The government has also prioritized an aggressive approach with some sizable investments in healthcare and infrastructure that carry a very high multiplier and also will help to ease the stress on the banking sector. The move towards providing a 35% rise in capex, divestments other than IDBI, strategic privatization of 2 banks and 1 general insurance company will not only add to the government revenue, but will also bring the required muscle power for sustained growth. It's a good budget and likely to open numerous opportunities for both domestic and foreign investors. On the domestic front, the budget also unveiled a significant rejig in basic custom duties to promote domestic manufacturing and help India become the part of the global value chain. The PLI scheme is undoubtedly expected to give much needed boost to the auto sector as well. It's a directional budget towards Atmanirbhar Bharat and focus on the fundamentals. With this, let me go over to Mr. Bhargava with my first question. Mr. Bhargava, COVID-19 has had varying degrees of impact across industries and companies. While one is hopeful of a sustained V-shaped recovery to drive domestic demand, how do you see the Indian manufacturing industry trending over the next 12 to 18 months? And what are also some of the areas that industry should focus on in terms of ease of business, sustainability, and innovation as it navigates through the pandemic?
Indian manufacturing for decades has been operating at a growth rate of something around 6 to 8% a year. And I think we'll get back to that kind of growth rate. Probably by the end of this year, we will recover to the original levels of growth. But the real issue, Neeraj, is that a 6 to 8% growth is not enough. As the finance minister said in a budget speech this time, and it's the first time such a statement has been clearly made by the government, a double-digit growth in manufacturing is required if the $5 trillion economy target is to be met. And this was, of course, apparent even earlier, that without double-digit, and I would say in double digits, about mid-double-digit growth rates are required if India is to create enough jobs for its youth, if we are to create the kind of resources for the government which are required to implement the minimum social programs which are necessary in this country, and if India is to become a significant player in the export of manufactured goods from India. For all of that, something less than around 14-15% growth rate of manufacturing is not enough. And therefore, this recovery, as we talk about, recovery to the old rates, to my mind, is not enough. It's not just enough for us.
And what are the few aspects that you would like to stress on in terms of that A, from a industry perspective, and B, from the government side of it? Some measures the government has taken. Are there some, let's say, 3 or 4 measures which the government could take further in terms of boosting this growth higher than the one which we're expecting from an older rate perspective? And if I may also say that if you could nuance that with the challenge the industry was facing pre-pandemic, because you said that the growth rates were 6 to 8%, which were not healthy enough there. So if you could just give our views a little bit of a view on that as well.
See, prior to the pandemic, the reason why industry was not growing fast enough was several. But the most important among them was the fact that manufacturing in India was high cost, was not really competitive. And it was high cost because of the policies which have existed right from 1950, where the policies relating to industry were designed in a manner that those policies will result in creating resources from the industry for subsidizing goods and services to poorer sections of the population. Because this was the days of socialism when this started. And socialism meant that the poorer people had to be looked after, which is perfectly valid. But where I think we went wrong was in thinking that you could look after the poor people by increasing the cost of manufacturing and industrial activity in India. Because that made the costs of manufacturing high, we became less than competitive. It deterred foreign investors from coming into India. Higher costs of production, plus the higher taxations which were levied on a lot of items which were manufactured again as part of socialism, resulted in the demand being kept down. And so if you have low demand and you have high costs of production, your growth rate is not going to be high at all. So in the period up to 1991, in any case, the private sector didn't have much of a role to play. It was largely public sector. And public sector, as you know, has never really managed the kind of growth cycle which industry would normally be expected to manage. They didn't generate internal resources. They were not required to make profits and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into that. But they did not lead to growth of industrial activity. After 1991, the private sector was still kept down from its growth because of the higher rates of taxation on manufactured goods, the higher costs of production, and the deterrence which these provided for foreign investors to set up manufacturing in India. So all of these have kept down our manufacturing to the kind of figures we have been talking about.
And in terms of, if you were to just add your perspective on the like a research and development aspect of it as well, compared to like global corporations and also larger corporations, the kind of spend which happens in India, on innovation and research part of it.
See, private sector till 1991 had no incentive at all to invest any money in R&D because you couldn't grow, there was no competition. So why would you waste money on trying to develop better products? After 1991 also, the requirement of doing R&D is that there should be a growth market, that you need to compete. And for most products, there is not much of a growth market. The size of the companies in India has remained small. And unless you generate enough internal resources, which after meeting the requirements of the shareholders and after meeting investment requirements and labor payments and things, you have surplus left, only then can you invest in R&D. And usually R&D is not possible unless the company is of a size which is adequate to provide internal resources surplus internal resources which can be put into R&D, because I don't believe it's wise to try and do R&D with borrowed funds. R&D has an element of risk in it, and to do R&D with borrowed funds, I think would be putting the company's future in great jeopardy.
And so, Bhargava, like, so what you are kind of moving towards is that we had a low demand, we had the markets protected to a longer period of time, and then when we opened them up as well, the competition has not been adequate, and also the relatively smaller size of the companies has kind of created a kind of a vicious circle, wherein the companies are not able to plow back, the money that is required for R&D, and at previously they didn't see the need itself, for doing it, or they were not forced, from a requirement perspective.
Correct. There's not enough compulsion on the companies because of competition. Because if there is strong competition, you will make all efforts to improve your products, reduce your costs, and do all of that. That has not happened here. And only a few sectors became competitive. You take the telecom section. It became highly competitive, and there was a lot of price reduction happening there, and the growth of the industry was high, and customer services improved. You take the automobile sector, with which, of course, I am connected, and there you've seen that a lot of competition developed over time, and that has led to products in India being of world class. But those are very limited sectors. In manufacturing, there are not too many sectors where you can say there was competition. What is also a fact is that foreign capital has come in a very, very limited manner into manufacturing. There's been a lot of direct foreign investment which has come into India and which is still coming into India, but it's not coming into hardcore manufacturing. It's coming into all kinds of technology, it's coming into pharmaceuticals, it's coming into all things of that kind. It's not coming into hardcore manufacturing. And there again, the problems are, in the last 4-5 years, ease of growing business has certainly increased. But the factors which fundamentally affected competition, and which, as you said in your introduction, this budget has started to address those factors. Public sector companies controlling infrastructure, controlling a lot of basic industries, but not producing at all to international levels of competitiveness. There have been a big drag on the competitiveness of the private sector after 1991. The public sector banks, because they were public sector banks and they had various social objectives to fulfill, it meant that the lending rates for the industry had to be raised so that they could fulfill their social objectives, do priority sector lending and that kind of thing. And still they were making losses, and which meant that government was periodically having to put money into these companies from tax resources. We ran a number of PSU companies, and we are still running them, which are making huge losses and which are a big drain on, again, the revenues of the country. All revenues which have could have gone into building infrastructure, building health, building education, has gone into subsidizing public sector. So the public sector, including public sector banks, public sector insurance companies, have actually been a big drag on growth of industry, growth of the economy, and competitiveness of industry. So fortunately for us, I hope this trend will continue. This budget clearly shows a reversal of those strategies. I think the finance minister has very clearly said that privatization is the goal, and the public sector will now become a very, very small and limited sector confined to maybe four strategic groups of industries and only three or four PSUs in each group. So I think that's a big step forward for the country.
So going forward, we see a much better, prospectively, if the, this what's being planned, if it's put into execution, and the implementation pace. Are you concerned with the, the pace of implementation, or in terms of, the fact that, the divestment targets, which we have set out and what we achieve, there has been a gap on those areas.
See, the divestment targets have mostly fallen short of what was set out. And I think the processes are such that it becomes very difficult, especially because there is a lot of, what should I say, hindsight examination of decisions taken by people who are involved in this. You had this case of the some privatization of hotels, which was done about 15 years back, being open today, and people being accused now. You will not proceed with privatization if that remains the kind of people today are worried that after they've retired, they may be hauled up and put into jail for something which they took in good faith at this time. So that's one factor. The second factor is that we have taken up a massive infrastructure program. Government's ability to implement projects, infrastructure projects primarily, including power stations and things, have always been less than adequate. The history of cost and time overruns is enormous. Every few months you see a report from the government itself which sets out how many projects are overrun and how the cost escalation has been another 100 and some thousand crores and things of that kind. I think that's another area which requires attention. And I think fundamentally it is this lack of trust in people. It is second guessing decisions in hindsight. You can't do that. I mean, nobody will take decisions if somebody will sit back and after 5 years, 10 years, examine the decisions and say this could have been done better. Most things could be done better if you look back on anything which is done. It's not that, and that is why we know what the Japanese say, Kaizen. Kaizen means that everything is capable of improvement at all times, which means that if I'm doing something today, tomorrow the next guy can sometimes and usually will find ways of improving what I did. But it doesn't mean that what I did was the wrong thing. This improvement process is something which is ongoing and the things will continue. It's only if somebody is clearly acted in bad faith, has made money for himself, then you should prosecute him. But otherwise, I think the system needs to show much more trust in the officers, much more trust in the people taking decisions, and not have independent agencies of various kinds who are not at all aware of the pressures which people have when they take decisions to meet timelines and things like that. So I think this process needs to be improved because otherwise this whole intention of speeding up infrastructure and things is going to get stuck badly. We will not meet our targets of disinvestment. We will not run our projects as well as we should.
Sure. So essentially, the focus should be to see that, while we are laying out a framework, from a year perspective there, but it has to be longer directional, perspective as well, giving us more predictability in terms of the policy and also in terms of the stability in terms of the taxation aspect of it as well. And then also looking at that the framework should be taking into care the perspective of how the implementation is also, and the people who are implementing it, have one, a guidance available, and B, in terms of subsequent a retrospective relook at some of these things is something that we should be avoiding to the max possible there.
Fundamentally, there has to be more trust and people should not be called to account unless it's clearly established that they have taken personal benefit out of something.
Wonderful. Sure. So at this point in time, let me, Mr. Bhargav, more zoom into the auto industry. There, given that the as you saw and you've been hearing also that there is a lot of push that the government's doing, to the domestic manufacturing, and you did discuss some of the challenges that we face, from a pre-liberalization to post-liberalization era as well there. So I think in this budget specifically, the government kind of revisiting some of the custom duty across several products, including auto components as well. So this is likely to force companies in your industry to kind of reduce their import dependency on other countries, including China. And how do you see the industry responding to this?
The customs duty to reduce the import dependency is by itself not adequate. There are various reasons why people are importing what they import. Primarily, of course, they are importing because in most cases that particular product is not available in India. Now, why it is not available in India can be for several reasons. Nobody is making it in India because technology is not available. Nobody is making it in India because the scale of demand in India is too small to make it economically. And it's no point doing import substitution. If the locally made product is, let's say, 30% or 40% higher in cost than the product which you can import, or if the quality is not up to the mark, to that make it acceptable to the customer, because you don't want to lose competitiveness of a product merely because you want to say, I don't want to import. So one has to be careful how one does this. You look at semiconductors today. India has no semiconductor industry. What is the option for various kinds of manufacturers but to import the basic semiconductors from outside? And what is happening in India is that there's a lot of assembly work going on. You take the battery manufacture for electric vehicles. Nobody today has invested in India in making batteries on any scale. Suzuki has a project for making batteries, but those largely specialized batteries for hybrid vehicles. For normal EVs, there is no battery plant yet. China has a huge scale and huge capacities for this, so people are importing that. On the other hand, you do need customs duty production if a new unit does start for import substitution. And it's clear that this unit will take, let's say, 3 years or 4 years before it can attain the volumes of sale which will make it economic. To protect this unit and to enable it to reach at least youth from its birth, you need to give it some protection in the way of customs duties. So what I'm trying to say, Neeraj, is that the selection of customs duties for promoting local manufacture has to be very carefully and selectively done and used as a means of nurturing new domestic industry, so that that new domestic industry can mature and then become competitive on its own.
Correct. Correct. So in terms of if you were to like try and break it down in terms of, we do have PLI at the current time given out. We do have this combination of some of the custom duty coming in on some of the items, not on all of them around it. And then there is a general ease of doing business also, in some way with lesser focus on compliance or lesser burden on compliance rather, is coming through around it. So if you were to say that, deconstruct it a bit to say that which are the 3-4 measures, which if they are taken together, instead of maybe in a like an intermittent manner, would kind of create a very good, strong impact, for promoting domestic manufacturing?
I think the main thing which is required is that growth of consumption of in manufactured products has to grow much faster. We started from the 6 to 8% growth of manufacturing industry. Now, if that 6 to 8% on the present base of manufactured goods in India could be stepped up to 12 to 15%, the volumes of demand which will be coming in and which people can forecast that, look, if I start a factory today, in 3 years' time, the total demand for the product will increase by 50% or 55%. Then I have a lot of confidence in putting up that investment. The foreign investor will also see here is a market which is growing at 12 to 15%. And it has great scope for me to attain very good volumes and very good economies of scale, and maybe provide a platform for low-cost manufacturing for exports from India. So I think the key to a lot of this business of Make in India lies in creating an assured demand visible to investors in the future. Today, that is unfortunately not there. The demand picture, if people, you look at, again, let me get back to cars.
Sure.
The data for the growth of the car industry shows that over the last 10 years, the compound annual growth rate of car sales in India has declined from over 10% a year to 1.5% a year in the last 5 years. Now, that kind of figure is available to investors. Everybody knows this. Will they be enthused to make big investments in India on either car manufacture or even component manufacture? Because where will they see the demand coming from? And if they don't see long-term sustained demand, but long-term meaning sustained demand for the next 5 to 10 years, why would they invest? So I think the starting point of all of this is create conditions in whichever industry you select. But overall, if you want to create the infrastructure for Make in India, then you have to create the demand for Make it in India products so that they become competitive in terms of quality and cost, which requires volume. The second part of it is the supply chain. No manufacturer makes 100% of any product himself. In the car industry, we buy out 70% round figure of the components from various suppliers. The supplier who's given me the component, the tier 1 supplier, has his own tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And the total number of people in the supply chain actually run into thousands. But all of them have to be of the same standard of quality and cost and competitiveness. Otherwise, my product will not be competitive either. And we run into a problem there because many of the small-scale industries who form part of the supply chain do not have the resources in terms of capital, in terms then of equipment, in terms of manpower, to create the environment for sustained quality manufacturing. They don't have the resources to do what we discussed earlier about R&D because they're just too small. In Japan, the small-scale industries which provide components for the auto industry, and they are the tier 2 vendors, most of them are actually the people who have developed technology. But here are tier 2 vendors, even the tier 1 vendors are hardly able to develop technology. And we have, by treating people in the supply chain of modern industry in the same manner as other small scale industries, which could be retail shops, which could be repair shops, which could be oil mills, which could be wheat chakis, treating with all small scale industry, but treating them all under the same definition and with the same rules, I think has greatly hurt the supply chain development of India. And in that in turn has hurt the competitiveness of products, that has hurt people coming in, because I know a lot of foreign investors are hesitant to come in India because of the difficulties of the supply chain.
Sure. So, and if we just extended a bit, the PLI scheme that the government came up with from an auto components perspective, while the final details are yet to come on that, they did specify some of the threshold on the revenue side. 1,000 crore and investment of a 350 crore over there. So while we just spoke about the fact that the resources and the availability, with the MSME sector, is a challenge for them to do further investments and come up with a cost competitive product. How do you read this? Is this limit set at a higher level, or this limit is at a lower level, which will lead to further, let's say, thinned out, program around this area?
I think small scale industries who form part of supply chains of manufacturing products should have a totally different definition of what a small scale industry is. It cannot be the same definition as a retail shop. It cannot be the same definition as a repair shop. It cannot be the same definition as localized industries catering to small communities. So I think we need to understand that, all these things are different kinds of creatures. And the supply chain components, by components I mean the manufacturing components of a supply chain, the small scale industries which form part of the supply chain, have to be treated understanding what the requirements of competitiveness are for an industry, and then to see that the rules are framed to encourage the company to achieve that standard of competitiveness. There should not be a barrier to that.
Sure, sure. And if we just focus now a bit on the export growth potential, given that, from an India perspective, auto components and, from an auto sector as well, there is a certain degree of exports which is happening and much larger than what was happening before. And at the same time, the cost of logistics, the impact of taxation on some of the matters, and then also in terms of some of the regulatory challenges, have been highlighted and also to remain as well in that. In that context, if the auto industry needs to get much more integrated with the external network, for that to happen, will the auto suppliers need to kind of scale up their global footprint, also integrate with larger network that the OEMs have, and like you rightly brought it out earlier also, that we need to be globally competitive from a cost perspective, there. So what would be some of the priority areas that you believe that the industry should be adopting to kind of expedite this integration process?
See, the fact is that we do export a pretty large amount of auto components. And if you read reports of ACMA and others, we all pride ourselves that, see, our exports have grown from zero to $11 billion or something like that. $11 billion sounds a lot of money. But the reality is that exports of auto components from India are about 1.5% of the global trade in auto components. And if you look at it in that perspective, it tells you that we are doing virtually absolute less than peanuts. And that is the reason, but the reason again is the same as what we've been discussing. Our industry is not either competitive in terms of quality. Cost maybe, but quality no. And we are not competitive in our ability to develop technology. And unless you are globally competitive in terms of quality, and I mean consistent quality, and which you can only do if your tier 2 and tier 3 vendors are also globally competitive in terms of consistent quality and, of course, cost. And there is technological capabilities in the country and amongst the manufacturers to keep developing new products as the customer wants abroad. You will not become exporter of auto components where you have, let's say, 10% of the global market. And we should have. We have the capability of having that kind of a market, but we don't have it.
And to some extent, sorry,
again,
yes.
scale of operations and conditions for these companies to actually achieve. But there is one other factor. The entrepreneurs themselves have a lot of role to play in this. And I think, and this has been my sort of favorite hobby horse for a long time, I think in India, the Western style of management is inappropriate. And I think Indian management needs to learn a lot more from the Eastern countries in terms of management systems and how they manage. Because the Western style of management is no more competitive in manufacturing industry. Manufacturing industry has almost died out for a large spectrum of manufacturing in all the Western countries. Today, US is trying to get jobs back, but it's not really going to succeed in doing it. And more auto components, again, we're talking of, is outsourced. China has become a huge supplier of auto components. Korea is a supplier of auto components because costs and quality and technology all exist there. In India, I think our entrepreneurs, our managers, our promoters have all to understand the absolute benefits which they will get if they can create teamwork and maximize the resources of the company to create the bandwidth to improve quality, improve productivity, reduce cost.
You bring a very interesting comparison and insight, between the Western and the Eastern, ways of managing aspect of it. It'll be nice if if you could just highlight, let's say, 2 or 3 clear contrasts that you see, and if adapting to the Indian environment, because I mean, Maruti, where you've been, at the helm of affairs for such a long time. And there's an ecosystem which Maruti, when it came in, developed, with the vendor partnerships that were done, in supporting them with quality and, some of the other measures that were taken. Is there when you look on a go forward basis, we just started the decade, with 2021 now, given the pandemic behind us to a large extent, there. How do you see that, the 2-3 areas, where the Eastern style of management still holds much greater value and strength for the industry?
See, by Eastern, I'm primarily talking of Japan. And the main point I think I would like to make is not that Japanese did something which is very unique to them. But if you do a little thinking, today it's a competitive world. There are very few barriers to international trade today. And what makes an industry grow? Ability to be competitive. Now, workers in an industry, how do they prosper? Is it by having strong unions and fighting with the management and occasionally going on strike? or which of course will all not help the growth and productivity of the company? Or is it by becoming partners with the management and working to maximize the competitiveness of the company and then sharing some of the benefits which come from growth and the profitability because you are more competitive? I think the answer is clear that the job security of the worker is best ensured if the company is competitive and therefore is not under any threat of being wound up because it's going bankrupt. The ability of the company to provide benefits to the workers, whether it's in terms of salaries or perks or housing or schooling or any other thing, is only if the company generates the resources. And I think the workers have realized, at least in Maruti, we could make them realize right in the early 80s, that their best option was to maximize Maruti's productivity and Maruti's profitability, because then we could share some of that with them. The point is, of course, that the management should be willing to share part of the gains of better productivity and better profitability with the workers. And if you do that, and if the workers see that their efforts to improve the company lead to some gains for them also, and that the management is actually concerned about looking after the interests of the workers along with their own interests, then I think things become different. The Western style is where you have huge differences between the income levels of the workers and the management. And there is no attempt made to persuade the workers to join in growing the company. It's not taken as a role of the management that you have to win the confidence of the workers and persuade him that look, and teach him that look, the best option for you is to actually work with us and jointly create a good company. So that teamwork aspect is what I think distinguishes the Japanese management. How to create teamwork. How to create teamwork in the political and social environment which you have. I think that's what each management has to think of. The same approach we followed with vendors. Ultimately, vendors were being set up for Maruti because there was nobody else in the field. They were largely dependent on us for business. Was it not absolutely clear that their growth and our growth was totally interlinked? If we did well, they would do well. If we failed, they would fail. There was this huge interdependence between us. It is not a situation of buyer, seller, and my trying to squeeze them out, and they're trying to maximize their price from me, because that's not the object. The object is to maximize the growth of the company. The more Maruti grows, more the vendors will grow, which is what happened. And so we adopted this approach of working as partners. Now, why this is not understood by industry as a whole, I don't quite fathom. Because it's clear to everybody, to me, is that vendors, suppliers, and the industry have to go hand in hand. Their futures are interlinked. Why they should not help each other, I don't understand. We decided that it was in our interest to give vendors all kinds of help, including technical help, management help, administrative help, to improve. And our programs of improving vendor quality and vendor productivity and all of that, we have spent a lot of money on that. That's all paid back.
You make it sound so easy, Mr. Bhargava, the way, because you've done it, and it's improved as well.
It is actually not difficult. But you have to understand that that is the way to go. If you say that, no, I'm the buyer and I'm the boss, these guys are just suppliers and they have to therefore listen to whatever I say, it doesn't work.
No, truly. I mean, I think while the interpretation is that they are at an opposing forces, to see that that you are able to buy something at a lower and lower cost around it, and of
Sure.
course get the quality that you want. But like you said, with the partnership framework coming in, you can achieve both with a higher scale and demand, which will come in.
In India, many of your suppliers don't know how to improve quality. Because we had access to Japanese technology, we could help them improve quality. We could help them improve productivity. But
Correct.
their improved productivity and quality ultimately benefited whom? Of course, they made profit, but so did I. So I'm not unhappy if both of us win.
That's right. That's right. So there's a strong message for the industry, in that, with the proven track record and performance as well, and also the benefits which have been there for all the constituents in terms of employee, company, as well as the vendor system as well there. Mr. Bhargav, I'm sure we are running out of time, but may I, if you have 5 minutes, and I just wanted to kind of touch upon the
Sure,
EV part of it as well. Would that be all right?
sure.
Okay. Just as a last question, electric vehicles, both from the perspective of environment and also from a a priority for the government as well, and policies like FAME 2 have provided significant opportunities to both domestic and the foreign players around it. If you were to look at them and say that what's in our view would be that some of the key tax compliance and incentives related aspects that the government should focus on in making the sector, as we've been talking, globally competitive. There seems to be like a huge demand which is untapped and just waiting to get deployed.
First, fundamentally, I believe subsidies should be used only if ultimately that product is going to be competitive and subsidies are only for a limited period. You cannot make a product grow in large volumes on the basis of subsidies. It must stand on its own feet. The problem today in India is that there are a number of problems actually, but let me name two or three of them. The first problem is that technology for batteries today, it was not, what should I say, it was believed 2 or 3 years ago that the cost of battery technology would develop and battery costs would come down drastically in 3 years' time. At that time, batteries were about $200 or something per kilowatt hour. And it was thought that 3 years later, it'll come down to around $70 or something per kilowatt hour. It's not happened. Technology has not developed as was expected. And there is no clarity even now, at least I don't have any clarity as to how battery technology and when battery technology will come to a level where the EVs can be affordable for small car holders, small car owners. Because in a small car, the cost of electrification becomes a major part of the cost of the car. In large cars, it is a comparatively smaller percentage of the cost of the car. And India is over 70% small cars. So if you electrify cars in India, at this point of time, it's only a small number of bigger cars which can possibly be electrified, and the market is very limited. The second issue, if you really are looking for large-scale electrification of cars in India, is that the lithium material, which is the basic raw material for batteries, is controlled by one country to the extent of almost, I think, around 80% of the sources of lithium are controlled by one country. And there is therefore a strategic issue in my mind as to whether India should become dependent on such a fundamentally important raw material as lithium for today's technology on sources which are controlled by one country. It's a question which I think is a large macro question for countries' energy security, which needs to be looked at. There is, of course, the cost of infrastructure. I believe that at the moment there is an option also which is being explored in many countries in the world of hydrogen as a source of fuel for clean energy and clean mobility. And for countries which have this large dependency on the material in terms of, no, technology for batteries may change and something else may develop. I don't know. If that happens, we have to reevaluate again. But otherwise, hydrogen has many attractions because on that it's absolutely clean and you're not dependent on a diminishing raw material. And as the Prime Minister said I think it was yesterday, that for the next decade, India should move to the gas economy. I am totally in agreement with what he says. I think because we are a small car country, I think in the next decade, we should maximize the use of CNG, biogas, whatever alternative fuels are available for reducing oil import, for improving the environment. And during this period, see how technology develops for electric cars and hydrogen cars, and then take a decision. Because we can afford this 10-year period because gas is a good intermediate solution to bridge this period from now till technology is more stable and more known as to what it is going to be. I don't think we should rush into this. Yes, electric vehicles are probably required for two-wheelers because there the gas option does not exist. But for cars and for CVs has an option of liquid petroleum gas, liquid natural gas. So those options should be explored for the next decade. And I think if we have to do EVs, we should then only try and develop EVs for the two-wheeler industry.
Great, Mr. Bhargava. I mean, thank you very much for a discussion on wide-ranging discussion and really insightful and helpful around it. Some really interesting takeaways for all of us as well as we go back with some fresh perspectives. We did discuss in terms of I think if I try and jog a little bit in terms of I think the focus that you stressed on, that we have to boost the demand there. And the growth that we're having, like 6 to 8% on the manufacturing side of it, while we will get that by the end of the year, but that is something which is not adequate, and we need to boost it up, to double it up effectively to almost 12 to 15%, and that would enable a kind of a cascading effect, where there would be demand coming in and more of a short demand rather to the investors, and lead to a more stronger capex cycle as well. There. I think your point around the fact that the enabling system needs to get created for the MSME sector by changing the definition, relooking at some of the way they are classified today, and also the support that they need to kind of boost the skill development, innovation that they're looking at is also a critical element, as part of the discussion that we did. And I think the point which you mentioned on the industry needs to probably look at it from the side of say that which are the management styles and practices which they have been practicing so far. How's the response to them has been for the different stakeholders which are part of the journey, and are there learnings which are there, which you also enumerated, from an Eastern management style, which something could be put into practice and lead to a betterment, for all the stakeholders, and create a more a win-win situation, for everyone around it. I think the point on the electric vehicles is certainly critical, and I think you do bring about a very a fresh perspective, a strong insight into the fact that there is a still a lag between the technology development, and we could bridge that, with the focus coming in on some of the gas, based vehicles as well. While we continue our efforts on the electrical vehicle side of it. I think, thank you very much, for the time. Clearly, the budget has, also focused a lot on fiscal prudence during the current perspective on that. So we do have a much needed booster shot, for our economy, hoping for a sustained V-shaped recovery. The government has shown its lot of intent in the budget, but as it happens, the real litmus test would be in its implementation. And for the auto sector, as we discussed, there is a significant potential to grab a much larger share of the world trade. You just mentioned 1.5%. I mean, it's, as you rightly said, it's peanuts than what we are doing right now. So we're just probably just peeling every onion at the surface. So the success of the scheme would depend on its specifics and how it will work on the ground there. So with that, once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Neeraj. It's been enjoyable talking to you. Thank you.